Have you ever wondered why people produce urine, but birds release droppings? Well, that's a question that we're going to answer in today's video on the excretory system. Let's start by looking at the purpose of the excretory system. All cells perform chemical reactions, like breaking down lipids or carbohydrates or proteins, and then using those for various purposes. Well, these chemical reactions produce waste, otherwise known as metabolic waste. And the job of the excretory system is to get rid of those wastes. The excretory system also helps regulate water and salt levels in the body because, as we've seen in previous lessons, cells like to be in an isotonic environment, and the excretory system makes that happen. Now let's take a look at mechanisms of excretion in different animals. We're going to see that there are different strategies depending on where an animal lives. One thing that all animals, all organisms in fact have in common is that proteins and nucleic acids are essential. And proteins can be broken down into amino acids, and nucleic acids are broken down into nitrogenous bases. Both of these reactions produce a waste product. The amino groups from these molecules are a nitrogenous waste because they are a waste that contains nitrogen. So cells need to get rid of this nitrogenous waste. Well, if you're an aquatic organism, what you'll do is you'll convert the amino group, NH2, into ammonia, NH3. Now that's a pretty easy process to do. You're just adding on a hydrogen, so it doesn't take a lot of energy. The problem is this is highly toxic. Fortunately for aquatic animals, they live in a huge body of water, so as soon as they release the ammonia becomes diluted and weakened, and so that works for them. If, however, you live on land, like most mammals, amphibians, and then there are some fishes as exceptions, that amino group is going to get converted into a chemical called urea. Now, as you can see, urea is a good deal more complicated than ammonia, so this takes extra energy to produce urea. However, urea is much less toxic than ammonia, so we don't need as much water to dilute it. Some animals that live on land, like birds and reptiles and insects, will convert the amino groups into uric acid. And as you can see, this is the most complicated of the three forms of nitrogenous waste. So this takes a lot of energy to produce. But the great thing about this is that it's not toxic, and so it can be released as a solid. So this will help birds and other organisms conserve water. They don't have to use any water to get rid of their nitrogenous waste. So let's sum this all up. All organisms metabolize proteins and nucleic acids, and thus they have to excrete nitrogenous waste. However, different organisms have different adaptations. For example, uric acid versus ammonia versus urea. And the adaptation they use, the nitrogenous waste they use, depends on its evolution and its environment. And to sum that up, remember that aquatic organisms excrete ammonia, which on the downside is toxic, but on the upside takes little energy or water, and plus, once the ammonia gets released into the water, it becomes weakened. Mammals, like this bear, excrete urea. On the bright side, it's less toxic. On the downside, it does take some energy to make urea, and it does require some water to excrete. As for birds and reptiles, they make uric acid, which is less toxic, yay. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of energy to make. That's a big trade-off. But it doesn't require any water. That's a big plus side. Now let's focus on the human excretory system, otherwise known as the urinary system. Its function, just to review what we talked about at the beginning of the lesson, is to produce and excrete urine, which contains nitrogenous waste. It will also regulate water and salt content of the body. Now let's take a look at some organs that make this possible. Here is the human urinary system. We're actually going to start with a part of the circulatory system, the aorta, because the aorta will carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. And then it will branch into the renal artery, which carries the blood into the kidney. Now we are actually in the excretory system. The kidney is the superstar. It filters blood, makes the urine. Once the urine is made, it is going to be transported through the ureter. and there are 2 ureters, one for each kidney. And then it will be stored, the urine, in the bladder. The bladder is a thick muscular organ, hence its storage capacities. And finally, the urine will be expelled through the urethra, which is a short muscular tube. Now, as for the blood that was filtered in the kidney, it's going to be taken back out through the renal vein, and it's going to join up to the vena cava and head back to the heart to get oxygenated. Now let's zoom in on the kidney, where most of the work happens. Remember that kidneys are made up of functional units called nephrons. So if we zoom in here, we would see this nephron, which is really just a tiny tube surrounded by capillaries. And any kidney has about 1 million of these nephrons, 1 million filtering units. So ultimately, the nephron's job is to do this. It wants to keep the blood composition nice and healthy. And the blood is made up of plasma, which is water, that contains some water, salt, ions, and then nutrients like glucose and amino acids. It also contains cells, white blood cells, platelets, and red blood cells. So the kidney wants to leave the blood this way while making urine, which will contain drugs, salts, if there's too much salt in the body, ions, urea, which is our nitrogenous waste, and of course some water for it to be dissolved in. Let's take a look at the nephron and see how this works. This picture shows a nephron a little bit simplified. So this tube is just the nephron all stretched out. And then here we've got a capillary. First thing that happens is that the blood is filtered, and water and small molecules from the blood will enter into the nephron tubule, and that material is called the filtrate. The next thing that happens is that the capillaries will reabsorb valuable materials, things like water, salts, glucose, amino acids, nutrients, all the good stuff. Then, bad stuff from the blood, like drugs and poisons, will be secreted into the nephron tubule to become part of the urine. And then finally, the final product, urine, which contains urea, water, and salts, will exit the kidney, and that process is excretion. Keep in mind that the structure of the nephron makes this possible. By being a long, thin tube, it is able to exchange materials very easily with the long, thin tube of the capillary. And the exchange of materials involves both active and passive transport to move from one area to another. And that concludes our quick exploration of the excretory system.